Today, in a Senate hearing, Chris Van Hollen questioned Howard Lutnick directly. Lutnick said his contact with Epstein had ended. But the Epstein files tell a different story. First, let's watch this clip. Then we'll break down the facts and the documents. Stay with us until the end.
Secretary Lutnick, as I said in my opening statement, you led people to believe that you had cut off all contact with Jeffrey Epstein after the 2005 encounter you and your wife had in his apartment. But as I'm sure you know, the Epstein files show a very different record of interaction. Why do the Epstein files show you coordinating a meeting and planning a visit with Jeffrey Epstein on his private island in December 2012?
Thank you for the question. I'm glad to be here to make it clear that I met Jeffrey Epstein when I moved to a house next door to him in New York, right? And I met him then. Over the next 14 years, I met him 2 other times that I can recall, 2 times. And that is none for 6 years. So 6 years later, I met him, and then a year and a half after that, I met him, and never again. Probably the total, and you've seen all of these documents, of these millions and millions of documents, there may be 10 emails connecting me with him, probably about 10 emails connecting me with him over a 14-year period. I did not have any relationship with him. I barely had anything to do with that person, okay?
Secretary Lutnick, I think you understand the root of concern here. It's the way you described very emphatically your first encounter with him in his apartment, said you were disgusted, would never have any contact with him again. Did you, in fact, make the visit to Jeffrey Epstein's private island?
I did have lunch with him as I was on a boat going across on a family vacation. My wife was with me, as were my 4 children and nannies. I had another couple they were there as well with their children, and we had lunch on the island. That is true, for an hour, and we left with all of my children, with my nannies and my wife, all together. We were on family vacation. We were not apart. To suggest there was anything untoward about that in 2012, I don't recall why we did it, but
Mr. Secretary, again, as I said, there's not an indication that you yourself engaged in any wrongdoing with Jeffrey Epstein. It's the fact that you believe that you misled the country and the Congress based on your earlier statements, suggesting that you cut off all contact when, in fact, you had not. When you visited the private island, did you see anything inappropriate during that visit?
the only thing I saw with my wife and my children and the other couple and their children was staff who worked for Mr. Epstein on that island.
And you realize that, you know, this visit took place after he'd been convicted, right? I mean, you made a very big point of saying that you sensed that this was a bad person in 2005. And then, of course, in 2008, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution of a minor. And yet you went and had this trip and other interactions. Did you have a dinner in Epstein's New York City home in 2011?
No.
So the information that suggests that there was a dinner with Woody Allen and Woody Allen's spouse at the Epstein residence, there's nothing to that, is that right?
I actually don't know what you're referring to. There was, look, I looked through the millions of documents for my name, just like everybody else. Yeah. And what I found was there was a document that says that I had a meeting with him on, in May, I think, for an hour at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Not dinner or otherwise, for an hour at 5 o'clock.
All right. There's also a reference to the fact that Epstein had expressed an interest in meeting your nanny. Do you know whether Jeffrey Epstein ever met with your nanny?
No, I saw that. I had no idea what that was about. It had nothing to do with me,
No
as far as
interaction
I
at
know.
all with him on there?
No, as far as I know, no.
Would you, Mr. Secretary, be willing to ensure that the file is complete to share with this committee and the Congress your own records, any records you have that relate to Jeffrey Epstein?
I will surely talk about that. I hadn't thought about that. I have nothing to hide, absolutely nothing.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I do think this goes right to the heart of the question of credibility based on the Secretary's earlier statements. I hope to pursue some of the other issues in front of the hearing as we go on. Thank you.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being.
Today, we are laying out the full context behind the Senate hearing involving Chris Van Hollen and Howard Lutnick, strictly based on documented reporting and what was said on the record, without speculation and without adding allegations that were not made in the hearing itself, because the core issue here is not criminal conduct, but credibility and consistency, and that distinction matters. Over the years, multiple established news organizations, including Reuters, Associated Press, and Forbes, have reported on the broader release of Epstein-related records and the public debate around them, making it clear that appearing in those files does not equal wrongdoing, but that statements made by public figures can still be scrutinized when new documents come to light. In the Senate hearing, Van Hollen focused narrowly on that point, pressing Lutnick on earlier public remarks in which he said that his contact with Jeffrey Epstein had ended years earlier, following what he described as an unsettling encounter in the mid-2000s, and asking why later dated records referenced interactions that appeared to occur after that claimed cutoff. According to contemporaneous reporting summarized by Reuters and AP News, the documents referenced in the hearing include emails and scheduling entries that point to limited interactions in the early 2010s, including a brief visit during a family trip, and Lutnick acknowledged that visit under oath, describing it as a short lunch with his wife, children, and caregivers present, emphasizing that there was no separation from his family and that he observed nothing inappropriate during that time. Van Hollen repeatedly stated on the record that he was not accusing Lutnick of engaging in illegal behavior, a point that matters for viewers to understand, because the questioning was framed around whether earlier public statements accurately reflected the full timeline shown in the documents, not around criminal liability. Reuters reported the same day that senators were seeking clarity on whether Congress and the public had been misled, even unintentionally, when prior statements suggested a complete end to contact, while later records indicated at least some interaction after that point, and that framing was echoed by other outlets covering the hearing. AP News noted that Lutnick characterized his overall contact with Epstein as minimal, citing a small number of emails spread over many years and a handful of encounters, and reiterated that he had no ongoing relationship, while also conceding that his earlier phrasing may not have captured every isolated interaction reflected in the files. Forbes, in its coverage of the broader Epstein document releases, has emphasized that the value of these records lies in transparency and accountability, allowing journalists and lawmakers to compare public statements with documentary evidence rather than drawing conclusions unsupported by proof, and that same principle was evident in how the hearing unfolded. The timeline discussed publicly follows a clear sequence that has been widely reported: an initial introduction in the mid-2000s, Epstein's conviction several years later, and then sporadic references in records dated after that conviction, culminating in the 2012 visit discussed in the hearing. And by walking through those dates in order, Van Hollen aimed to show why the phrase "contact ended" raised questions once those documents became public. Coverage from Reuters and AP News stressed that Lutnick responded by saying he had nothing to hide, that he was willing to cooperate with requests for records, and that he believed the totality of the evidence showed distance rather than closeness, while lawmakers made clear that the public expects precise language when officials describe their past associations, especially in matters involving figures as notorious as Epstein. Importantly, no outlet reporting on the hearing stated that Lutnick was charged with or accused of a crime during this session, And several reports explicitly highlighted that the dispute centered on trust, transparency, and how statements age when new information emerges. This distinction is why many analysts quoted by mainstream media describe the exchange as a test of credibility rather than culpability, and why the hearing drew attention even without allegations of illegal conduct. The broader context, as reported by major news organizations, is that the release of Epstein-related records has prompted renewed scrutiny of many public figures. But responsible reporting consistently reminds readers that documents alone do not establish guilt, and that each name mentioned requires careful, case-by-case evaluation. In this case, the hearing record shows that Van Hollen's questioning stayed within those bounds, repeatedly acknowledging the absence of wrongdoing allegations while still pressing for clarity on past statements. And Lutnick's answers, as covered by Reuters and AP News, combined acknowledgement of limited post-2005 contact with an insistence that those interactions were benign and infrequent. That is why, when this exchange is broken down carefully, the key takeaway is not scandal, but process. How democratic oversight works when lawmakers compare prior public claims with newly available records, and how officials are expected to respond when discrepancies are raised. The hearing illustrates how transparency laws and investigative reporting intersect, allowing journalists, senators, and the public to ask informed questions grounded in documents rather than rumor, and why citing dates, sources, and original reporting is essential to maintaining trust. As multiple outlets have noted, credibility in public life often hinges not on whether someone committed a crime, but on whether their explanations remain consistent as facts evolve, and that was the standard applied in this case. If you are watching this breakdown alongside on-screen visuals of headlines from Reuters, AP News, or Forbes showing publication dates and source logos, that presentation reflects exactly how this story has been covered in the press, with emphasis on verification, attribution, and context rather than conjecture. And that brings us to the central conclusion, supported by the reporting. The Senate hearing did not establish criminal conduct, but it did underscore why precise language and full disclosure matter, especially when past associations become part of the public record. If you value clear, fact-based breakdowns that stick to what reputable news organizations have actually reported and separate evidence from assumption, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more straight-down-the-middle analysis.